My background is, I suppose, literature and philosophy as much as technology, or perhaps more so than technology. And so I'm going to take the title of the session rather literally and briefly sweep you through about 5,000 years of human history in connection with a topic that is of particular interest to me, failure. Failure in the context of games. I asked the question, what is failure? The answer, in a sense, is falling short. And in life, failure is a very, very serious business. If we're zipping back 5,000 odd years, it gets you killed. It might get you fired now. Failure is bad. What is learning? Failing better is one of the phrases that I think sums up something at the heart of learning, I guess, and also, I think, at the heart of games. And taking this sweep of human history briefly, I think one of the most interesting things about games, which are more ancient than civilization, completely universal in human cultures, is that games have traditionally been about very, very serious things. Because the more serious a thing is, the more important it is that you get to practice it, because failing it in real life kills you. So the very earliest human games and forms of play were to do with warfare. People would practice their fighting skills. People would formalize warfare into games and combat, because otherwise you just ended up with wholesale sort of Holocaust-style slaughter. People had to formalize these things because they could not be practiced. Games were to do with social hierarchy, with knowing your way around people, because to test the social hierarchy within a play setting was safe. To test it within a real setting was potentially deadly. And so learning has always been integrally bound up with play, as I'm sure I don't have to tell most of the audience here. And it's about this ability to do things safely, to, in a sense, to suffer the consequence, being learning, being improvement, being able to make mistakes. And we've heard talks from the medical profession, we've heard people talking from the army, from these most serious fields. And it's no coincidence that in many ways, if you're looking at serious gaming, that strange contemporary oxymoron, the area where it's made most progress in terms of budgets is places like the military and medicine. The US military spends about $6 billion a year on simulated programs because you have to simulate these things. The medical benefits of simulations of gaming are really just starting to be felt in force and having a lot of money put into them. So, this is one of my favorite quotes from Samuel Beckett, who rather nicely sums up the idea of failure as, in a sense, absolutely integral to the process of getting better. If you don't try and fail, we were hearing a quote from Winston Churchill in the last talk, then you will not get better. And I want to look now specifically at how electronic games really have a transforming effect when it comes to failure in our culture and to the future of learning in that context. Play humanizes technology. I think this is one of the absolute key things. If you look at electronic games as a subset of the grand category of games, you have a lot of human constants in there, but what you have is this incredible rate of feedback and automation. You have an incredible capacity for iteration, the kind of environments you get electronically. And when I say play humanizes technology, I want to leap to one of my favorite examples of a beautiful game. People say, what's your favorite game? And it's very hard to pick. I've been lucky enough to get to write a book about computer games, which involved lots of very extensive, labor-intensive research. And one of my favorite games is Genova Chen's game Flower for that game company, which was awarded a BAFTA recently. And the reason I love that is not because it sort of consumes more of my time than other games. It doesn't. It's because if I want to show people what games can do, I can simply put the control pad in their hands and say, well, have a look at this. Now, if we look at technology in general, computers, really still, remarkably, after sort of 50-odd years, they're quite a hostile thing for those who don't know. If you get someone who hasn't used a computer before, someone who is older, someone who is disabled, someone who doesn't have excellent coordination even, your grandmother, my grandmother, say, and tell them, use this browser, they'll have a lot of problems. It relies on a series of conventions. The rule set, you have a mouse, a little thing on a string that moves around. You have a keyboard that you're typing on. Both are pretty daunting. Both don't have much of an underlying logic. A computer keyboard is like that because typewriters were like that. Typewriters are like that because the keys stuck when they put them together, so they ended up with this random mishmash of keys. It's very difficult. Whereas I take the controller for Flower, I put it in someone's hands, and by moving it and pressing a button to make the wind blow, they are interacting with an incredibly sophisticated piece of technology. And you can do this. This is the great story of the Wii, of course. And what's happening when they are holding that controller and moving around in space is they are undergoing a very particular kind of learning experience that is unique to electronic games because they are receiving constant feedback. They are, if you like, desperately trying to pick up the first petal, get the wind going, move around. They're failing hundreds of times a second. But the kind of failure they are encountering is, if you like, something on the road to success. It is not a punishing failure. It's not the failure of, I can't double-click and now a computer's gone wrong and I can't see my desktop. It's not the failure of perhaps an old-fashioned learning situation where the door slams, you have the negative mark, you can't get any further in the book, you don't understand the word. I mean, good teachers are fighting against this kind of thing all the time. The kind of failure they're experiencing is that of constant feedback in an environment that has been structured for them to explore experimentally. They are experimenting with the physics of the world. And the interesting thing about a game like Flower is that a vast amount of labor has gone in order to make it easy, in order to make this an intuitive learning experience. We're all familiar with bad games. Doing a bad game is a little bit like sitting an exam. You have to try and work out exactly what the bad game designer was thinking, because there's only one way to do this puzzle, and it may not be logical. There isn't what you might call a loving physics behind it. There isn't an environment you can gently test and probe and explore. You can't get that past that point. And games, I think, have come a very, very long way very fast in this because of their very nature. The very first games were rubbish at teaching, basically. They were incredibly punitive learning experiences. Trying to play Space War, the first video game, it was an awful lot more fun than trying to program a PDP-1 computer with a ticker tape, but it was very, very, very hard. And I think one of the most radical things we're seeing recently in games is enormous leaps forward in this learning experience, in the accessibility. And so, the trend I'm interested in a game like Flower is failed, the experience of failure, this experience that ends learning, that for someone shuts them off from progress, where their mistake does not become part of a process of progress, where the mistake instead becomes a turn-off. That is translated into not yet succeeded, because there isn't this censure associated with failure. There isn't this barrier coming down. Instead, there's a testing and a probing and an incidental delight. There's many paths open to you. It is an experimental process. We've heard some wonderful talks yesterday, games like Little Big Planet, about the way that this sort of underlying physics is enormously enabling. It's enormously empowering for people. It gives them a sense of ownership of this learning process. And I want to talk about a second game, which for me is one of the most exciting learning experiences in games of the last few years. It's not an educational game as such. It's New Super Mario Bros. Wii, which is, I think, absolutely wonderful. And I didn't quite realize how wonderful it was until I started to play it two-player, mostly with my wife, who is a gamer, but not a gamer with the background as me. I grew up playing fiendish platform games. She really came in through casual games and played too much World of Warcraft with me. And what I realized with this game was that it had solved a couple of really, really interesting problems, which was how to have the cooperation, the cooperative experience of the environment being rewarding for weak and for strong players. Because, as you may know from the game, you can pop into a bubble, one player can, and be sort of pulled along the screen magically by the other player past the challenges until the point at which they decide to come out of the bubble again. And this, I think, is a demonstration of the kind of avenues for learning that games open up, philosophically speaking, the kind of principles behind them. Because what you've got is two people, or three people, or four people collaborating within a virtual environment in which those with less skill and those with most skill are able to coexist. And they want to keep coming back. People say to you, please come and play Super Mario Bros. Wii with me. It's much more fun with two, it's much more fun with three. And so the weaker player is taken through the level by the stronger player. The barrier doesn't come down. The learning experience doesn't end for them. My wife has now got good at platform games. This is an amazing thing to be saying. You have no idea how unlikely that was. It's a very difficult skill set, jumping around little platforms. And this game has trained her to do that in a way that if I'd sat her in front of Mario 3 and then emulated for 15 years, it would never have happened. She'd have got fed up. The game has another innovation you'll also know about called the Super Guide. If both of you are not that good, or you fail 7 times, I think it is, in a row, then the game takes over. It says, right, I don't want you to quit at this point. I don't want your failures to become a source of, I'm never going near this dramatic game again. It says, here, let me show you. Here's what you should do. It takes over from you, takes you to the level, and you can touch the controller at any point to come back in again. Now, it's something very simple, but it's something that the kind of world and environment building that a really well-made game can do that other media can't do. And it's a tremendous learning experience and a very exciting one. And I don't know if you can read there, Mr. Woody Allen, a great thinker on the matter of games. I'm not quite sure what his metric was, but the idea that 80% of success is showing up, I think, has an awful lot of truth in it, because broadly speaking, in learning, I'm not a teacher. I mean, I have taught and lectured, but I'm certainly not a teacher. But I think it's often said with some truth that the real test is not the best students. Just as in a company, the real test of the corporate structure is not the 2 or 3 people who are just so good they're going to make it anyway. The real test is the rest, is the weakest people. How good is this system for those who are in the bottom half? And the most certain way of failing is not to try in the first place. And here we have one of the central issues to do with failure in a lot of traditional learning and training settings, not just schools, everywhere. And that is that people are very, very afraid of failure. So they don't try in the first place, because the experience they expect to have, the environment they're encountering, the context in which they're trying to learn is one in which failure is something that terrifies them or that shuts down their options. And so, in a sense, 80% of success being showing up, well, yes, you want people to show up. You want everyone to show up. I know from listening to and talking to people like Derek Robertson, who's done such astonishing work with Learning and Teaching Scotland, that with games, what you see is something that has got people who normally don't care about maths, or who a good teacher has to try very, very hard to get to care about maths. And it is a way in for them, because it is something that is part of their life that they understand, but it is also, if you like, an environment that is not alienating, that is not censorious, that doesn't punish. It's empowering. It allows them to feel, to take charge, to be excited, to take risks. There's been very interesting research has been going on down in Bristol University. Paul Howard-Jones is one of the psychologists running it. And they've been looking into risk-taking in game scenarios. And very briefly, what they keep finding again and again is that in a game context, in a sort of automated electronic game context, people become more willing to take bigger risks. They become braver students, if you like. And the significance of this is that when people are taking risks, it's when they're learning. It's about failing better. You don't learn from being right all the time. 10 out of 10 proves something, but it doesn't necessarily teach. Whereas if you have the guts, if everyone in your class is unafraid to try and try again and try and try again, and they are all in it together, if that's the environment they're in, the learning curve is so much steeper. And he finds, I think the statistic is over 10% in terms of how much more willing people are to take the risks, to try to risk themselves. And so to wrap up looking at this, and the reasons I think this is, as I say, central to games historically, but I think, talking about the future, it seems to me that the games industry is at a little bit of a point of transition with this. Everyone has been talking in the last year or so about the explosion in casual games and social games, and also, I think, simultaneously, spearheaded by the Wii, in the explosion in new ways of interacting with technology. We're going to have new Wii coming out. We're going to have a motion-sensitive DS. We're going to have Project Natal at some point. We're going to have Sony. We're going to have new ways of interacting with technology. And for me, what this does is suggests that the moment of universality is almost upon us, a moment at which the word gamers goes into retirement, like the word televisioners would sound ridiculous today, when it becomes obvious that games can be and are for everyone. And why this matters is, I think, it allows people to have a different relationship with technology. It allows their relationship with technology to be one where they are welcome into that world, where the barriers are lower, where the failure rate that is almost invisible to those of us who are fluent in technology, but which is an absolute barrier to many people who are not, where that goes down. And when that happens, I think the principles of play, and particularly this creative, experimental, empowering approach to exploring a world as a learning experience and the dynamics under that, I think that then begins to be unleashed. And as much as anything, the task of educators and games companies is, to face up to this reality and acknowledge it in the mainstream and say, this is part of the texture of people's lives, and we have the choice of to ignore it or to try and use it. And obviously, a conference like this is evidence that people are making very, very impressive steps in using those tools. But, as everyone will agree, there's far more to be done. So anyway, so I find talking about failure a very interesting way of talking about success in the future, because I really do think this can be something transforming socially and transforming in education and training. And I'm very excited indeed to see what will be coming up over the next 10 years and what we'll be talking about in 5 and 10 years' time here. I should also finish by mentioning that I have very cheekily brought along a few copies of my book. And if anyone would like to, my publisher makes me buy them off them very uncharitably. So they're yours for a tenner if you want to see me afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.